Hi guys, I'm Kalilah Reynolds and it's now time for Money Mondays, brought to you in partnership with Proven Wealth. Now this week I want to talk to you a bit about price versus value. I was doing my usual grocery shopping over the weekend and I wanted to buy some Cheerios for the baby. So I'm at the supermarket and there are two different flavors on the shelf. They had honey nut and they also had apple cinnamon. Now, as I'm deciding which one to buy, I noticed that they're not the same price. The honey nut was $475, while the apple cinnamon was $495. So I figured, well, that just made my decision super easy. Let's go for the cheaper one. But then I noticed that the apple cinnamon box looked bigger. They weren't on the same shelf, so it wasn't immediately obvious. So I looked at the net weight, and indeed, I was right. Apple cinnamon was 16 ounces, and honey nut was only 10 ounces. That's 60% more for just $20 or 4% more. Well, guess which one I chose? If you guessed apple cinnamon, you're absolutely right. Ding, 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 ding. Apple cinnamon was a bit more expensive, but a much better value. And it reminded me of some comments on my videos that I've been seeing lately. Things like, oh, I'm not going to buy this particular stock because it's too expensive. I'm going to wait on another cheap offer like Wigton. To those people, I'd like to ask a simple question. What is more important, price or value? Just because something is cheap doesn't mean it's a better value. In fact, how many times have you bought something cheap and it popped out in no time? Then you regret not spending the little extra bit for the better quality item. The same principle applies to stocks. Not just because a stock is cheap means it's a good value. And likewise, not just because it's relatively expensive means it's not a good value. Let's look at the example of NCB. A year ago, NCB was trading around $90. And while there was much interest, I also heard people saying, can't bother, it's too expensive. Well, guess what? A couple weeks ago, NCB traded at $200. It's since fallen to $175, but that's still a huge appreciation in 1 year, and there's still room for further growth. So what were those people saying about $90 being too expensive and waiting on some more 50 cents offers? That's price versus value. Not saying you can't get good value from a cheap stock too, just saying the two aren't necessarily the same thing, and price isn't the only thing you should consider when you're making your decision. So how do you know when something is a good value? Well, there are a few things that you can look at. One of them is called the net asset value, NAV. And look at that. The word value is right there in the title. The net asset value is a pretty simple formula. It's the fund's assets divided by the number of shares. So let's look at a current listing that's still open, Sagicor Select Funds, SSF. My friend Randy Rowe has done a good assessment of the net asset value for SSF over on his blog, everymickle.com. After the IPO, assuming it's fully subscribed, SSF will have a portfolio worth $5.63 billion, and they'll have issued 5.1 billion shares in total. Now, 5.63 divided by 5.1 is a net asset value of $1.10, but they're selling these shares at $1 each for the IPO, which means they're basically selling at a 10% discount. These shares are actually worth more than what they're being sold for. That's value. Another thing analysts often look at is called the price to earnings ratio, or PE. The PE measures a company's current share price relative to its earnings per share. For example, if a company's shares cost $20 each and you look at its financial statements and see that its earnings per share are $2, then that company has a PE of 10. Very simple math. 20 divided by 2 equals 10. The price to earnings ratio, or PE, is one of the most widely used stock analysis tools used by investors and analysts for determining stock valuation. In addition to showing whether a company's stock price is overvalued or undervalued, the PE can also reveal how a stock's valuation compares to its industry group. A high PE could mean that a stock's price is high relative to earnings and possibly overvalued. Conversely, a low PE might indicate that the current stock price is low relative to earnings. Does that mean the lower the PE, the better? Not necessarily. A high PE can also mean that investors are anticipating higher growth in the future. So it's not a cut and dried thing. And a low PE could mean that you're paying a low price now relative to its current earnings. But if you look at that alone, you're not taking into consideration what the company's potential for growth is. If you're confused by all of this, don't worry. The more you start applying these principles, the more you'll start to get it. And just like anything else, practice makes perfect. Same goes for investing. That's it for this edition of Money Moves. I hope I've helped you to understand the difference between a stock's price and how much it's actually worth, its value. I'm Kalilah Reynolds. See you next week.